The Georgia heat pressed down like a judgment. Thick, muggy, unmoving. It clung to the skin, soaked through shirts, and hummed with the tension of something unspoken. In the small town of Graymore, where magnolia trees lined streets like silent witnesses, folks gathered at Whitman's Hall, a faded brick building that once hosted wedding receptions, gospel nights, and, more recently, political debates that had taken on the heat of a battlefield. Inside, the air buzzed with anticipation, voices low and nervous. The podium stood empty under the flicker of aging lights. And seated near the front, his hands folded tightly, was Nathaniel Cross, a man many in a room had underestimated, some had written off, and one had just called unfit to lead. Nathaniel wasn't a man made for the spotlight. Not at first glance. 53, stocky, with streaks of silver in his thick, curly hair and eyes the color of storm-washed slate. He carried himself like a man who'd built things with his hands, and he had. For 30 years, he'd run Cross and Sons Roofing, passed down from his father, who'd taught him everything except how to dream bigger than shingles and scaffolding. But somewhere along the way, Nathaniel had started paying attention to the roads with potholes untouched for years, to the schools that couldn't keep good teachers, to the neighbors who'd lost their jobs when the textile plant shut down. And one night, sitting at his kitchen table while the coffee went cold, he'd written the words, "Maybe I should run." He never imagined that 3 years later, he'd be standing here on the verge of clinching the Democratic nomination for Georgia's 11th district, the first independent candidate to ever make it this far. But Stacey Abrams, the revered political titan of the South, had just slammed the brakes on his momentum. She'd said it on national television, calm and composed, with a tone that made it sting more than a shout. Nathaniel Cross is passionate. But passion isn't qualification. He's unfit. He's never held office, never drafted policy, never stood the test of governance. Her words echoed louder than any campaign ad, and they cut Nathaniel deeper than he cared to admit. He respected Abrams, grew up watching her fight voter suppression, uplift black voices, challenge the status quo with poise and principle. She was a hero to many, including his wife, Lorna, who'd marched beside her in Atlanta when the voting rights bills were under attack. So when Abrams dismissed him publicly, it wasn't just political. It was personal. Nathaniel hadn't responded. Not yet. But tonight, in Whitman's Hall, he was ready. And outside, the line of locals stretching down Main Street. Young and old, black and white, working class and worn thin, told him this wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about dignity, about being seen. From the back of the room, a boy's voice broke the hush. "Mr. Cross." All eyes turned. A teenager stepped forward, lanky, nervous, clutching a worn spiral notebook. "My mama wanted me to ask if you'd still fight for us, even if they say you can't win." The room held its breath. Nathaniel rose. His steps were slow, deliberate. The wood floor creaked under his boots. When he reached the podium, he didn't look at the cameras. He looked at the boy. "Son," he said, his voice steady as bedrock, "I wasn't born qualified. I became ready because life forced me to be." He turned toward the crowd. "I heard what Ms. Abrams said. I respect her. Always have. But calling me unfit." He paused. The room leaned in. "I've held a neighbor while he cried over losing his job. I've patched roofs during hurricanes when FEMA said help was 2 weeks away. I've paid employees out of my own pocket so they wouldn't miss rent. I've sat in broken-down school gyms and listened to parents beg for working heaters in January. No, I haven't held office, but I've held people. And if that makes me unfit," he spread his arms, "then maybe the definition of leadership needs changing." There was silence, then a single clap, then another. Then the room erupted, not with wild cheering, but something quieter, deeper. Respect. But behind that applause were deeper currents, and Nathaniel knew it. This campaign wasn't just about a district seat. It was about identity, about representation. And two forces were silently circling him: the weight of legacy and the pull of transformation. His son, Marcus, had his own battle simmering. A rising junior at Morehouse, Marcus had long seen his father as a provider, but not a visionary. Marcus wanted systemic change, bold, sweeping policies, not speeches from a man who'd spent most of his life climbing roofs. He loved his father, but he didn't believe in his campaign. "You're a good man, Dad," he'd said one night after a campaign event, "but the system needs architects, not repairmen." And Nathaniel had stared at his son, heart thudding. "Son, you think I don't want change? I just don't think we get there by talking over people's heads. We start by talking at their tables." The second tension came from Lorna, his anchor, his fiercest supporter, but also the one with fears too heavy to name. She knew politics could eat people alive. She'd watched too many community leaders rise and fall under the spotlight, their names dragged through mud. And she'd already lost her sister to cancer, her brother to the criminal justice system. She couldn't lose Nathaniel to ambition. "Promise me," she whispered one night, her hand in his, "if it starts to change you, if it makes you someone I don't recognize, you'll walk away." "I promise," he'd said. But in his heart, he wasn't so sure. 2 weeks after the town hall, Nathaniel was invited to a televised forum in Atlanta, and word came down that Abrams herself would be in attendance, observing. Not speaking, watching. The stage lights were blinding. The moderator asked pointed questions. One panelist, a seasoned policy analyst, grilled Nathaniel on education funding. "I may not have a policy degree," Nathaniel said, "but I've raised kids in a school district that was underfunded for decades. And I've sat with superintendents who cried because they had to choose between textbooks and teacher salaries. What I don't know, I'll learn. What I do know is how to listen. And listening is half the job." That moment went viral. Not because of what he said, but because of Abrams' reaction. A flicker of something crossed her face, respect maybe, or recognition. And when the moderator finally turned to her for closing thoughts, she stood slowly, looked directly at Nathaniel, and said only, "Sometimes the heart makes the best map. I may not agree with his methods, but I can no longer question his conviction." It wasn't endorsement, but it wasn't dismissal either. The next morning, Nathaniel found a handwritten note slipped under his office door. "Leadership doesn't come from titles. It comes from a fire to show up when it's hard. Keep showing up. Sa." He held the note in trembling hands. And for the first time in weeks, he wept. By November, Nathaniel didn't win the race. He came second, closer than anyone predicted. But what he won was something larger: trust, dignity, a voice for people who'd long been voiceless. Marcus stood beside him on election night, arms slung around his shoulders, whispering, "You didn't build a campaign, Dad. You built a movement." And Lorna? She watched her husband that night, tired, tearful, proud, and knew she hadn't lost him. He hadn't become someone else. He'd just become more of who he'd always been. The story of Nathaniel Cross spread far beyond Georgia. It wasn't the tale of a savage comeback or a political victory. It was something quieter, braver, a reminder that sometimes the most unfit are the most unbreakable, and that even in the shadow of giants, ordinary people can rise, speak, and change everything. And in the quiet of a house in Graymore, with a coffee mug warming his hands, Nathaniel sat by his window, watching the sun rise. He hadn't won, but he wasn't done.